The dust devil that swept through Teresa Bennett's chicken yard that scorching August morning in 1882 carried with it more than just New Mexico sand. It carried the scent of desperation, and maybe, just maybe, the promise of something she had long stopped believing in. Teresa stood at the edge of her property, watching the chickens scatter in panic as another gust threatened to blow away what little feed she had left. Her calico dress, faded from too many washings in hard water, clung to her thin frame. At 24 years old, she looked older, worn down by 3 years of widowhood and the impossible task of keeping 6 children alive in Hachita, a town that seemed determined to blow away into nothing with each passing season. The children were inside the adobe house her late husband had built before the fever took him. 6 hungry mouths. The phrase haunted her dreams and followed her through every waking moment. Emma was 9 now, old enough to help with the little ones, but still needing so much herself. Then came the twins, Jacob and Joshua, 7 years old and growing like weeds despite the meager meals. Sarah was 5, sweet-faced and quiet. Too quiet for a child her age. Little Thomas had just turned 3, and baby Margaret, not quite 2, still cried for milk Teresa could barely provide. She heard the horse before she saw it, the steady clip-clop of hooves on the hard-packed earth of the main road. Teresa shaded her eyes against the brutal sun and watched as a lone rider approached, leading a pack horse laden with supplies. He sat tall in the saddle, his dark hat pulled low against the glare, and even from a distance, she could see the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. The rider slowed as he neared her property, and Teresa felt her spine stiffen automatically. Strange men meant trouble more often than not, and she had learned to be wary. But this man simply touched the brim of his hat in greeting and called out, "Morning, madam. Chicken got loose there." Teresa turned and saw that one of her hens had indeed escaped through a gap in the fence, pecking hopefully at the barren ground near the road. She started toward it, but the chicken, recognizing the desperation in her movements, scuttled further away. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion and approached the chicken from the other side, moving with a patience that surprised Teresa. He did not rush or grab, simply herded the bird gently back toward the yard until Teresa could scoop it up and deposit it safely behind the fence. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse from lack of use. She spoke so little these days, saving her words for the children. "No trouble at all." The man smiled, and it transformed his face entirely. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-browned skin and dark eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Mason Rhodes, madam. Just rode in from Silver City, heading down to the border country for work." Teresa Bennett. She found herself studying him, despite her better judgment. There was something solid about Mason Rhodes, something that spoke of reliability in a world where nothing seemed reliable anymore. "You have a nice setup here, Mrs. Bennett," Mason said, looking around at the small property. His eyes were kind, not judging the obvious signs of struggle, the sagging fence, the thin chickens, the garden that had mostly surrendered to the heat. "It keeps us," Teresa said, which was not quite a lie, but not quite the truth either. From inside the house came the sound of crying, baby Margaret's wail cutting through the hot morning air. Then Emma's voice, trying to soothe, and the deeper sound of one of the twins arguing with his brother. Mason's expression shifted, understanding dawning. "You have children, then?" "6. The word came out before Teresa could stop it, heavy with all the weight it carried. "I have 6 hungry mouths." She had not meant to say it quite like that, had not meant to expose her desperation so plainly to a stranger. But the heat and the worry and the endless gnawing fear had worn her defenses thin. She waited for Mason to make his excuses and ride on, as most people did when confronted with the reality of a widow woman with too many children and not enough of anything else. Instead, Mason Rhodes smiled again, that warm, genuine smile that seemed to light something inside Teresa's chest that she thought had gone cold and dark 3 years ago. "Then let's feed them together," he said simply. Teresa stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "I said, let's feed them together." Mason gestured to his pack horse. "I have supplies here, more than one man needs, and I am handy with repairs if that fence needs mending. If you have work that needs doing, I would be happy to trade labor for a place to rest for a few days before I head south." "I cannot pay you," Teresa said bluntly, because she had learned that honesty, however painful, save time and heartache in the long run. Did I ask for pay? Mason's voice was gentle but firm. I asked for work and a place to rest, maybe some home cooking if you are willing. Trail food gets mighty tiresome after a few weeks. Teresa wanted to refuse. She wanted to send him on his way and maintain the hard-won independence she had fought for since her husband's death. But baby Margaret wailed again, and she thought of the near-empty cupboard and the children's thin faces, and pride seemed like a luxury she could not afford. The barn is not much, she heard herself say, but you are welcome to sleep there, and I can cook if you truly have food to spare. I have got flour and beans and salt pork, Mason said, already moving toward his pack horse. Some dried apples too, and coffee. Real coffee, not that roasted grain substitute. The mention of actual coffee made Teresa's mouth water. She had not tasted real coffee in over a year. Mason began unloading supplies, and Teresa led him toward the house, her mind reeling from how quickly her morning had changed. The children's voices grew louder as she approached, and she braced herself for the chaos of her daily life to be exposed to this stranger's eyes. She pushed open the door to find Emma trying to separate the twins, who were wrestling on the floor over a wooden horse that had seen better days. Sarah sat in the corner, playing quietly with a corn husk doll, and Thomas clung to Emma's skirt while Margaret screamed from her cradle by the window. "Boys, that is enough!" Teresa's voice cut through the noise, and the twins froze, looking up with matching expressions of guilt. Then they saw Mason Rhodes standing in the doorway behind their mother, his arms full of supplies, and their eyes went wide. "Children, this is Mr. Rhodes," Teresa said, moving to pick up Margaret, who quieted somewhat in her mother's arms. "He is going to be staying in the barn for a few days and helping with some repairs." Emma, ever the responsible eldest, stepped forward and offered a small curtsy. "Pleased to meet you, sir." Mason set down his load and removed his hat. "The pleasure is mine, miss. You must be the one keeping this whole operation running." Emma blushed at the compliment, and Teresa felt a flash of gratitude for this stranger's kindness to her daughter. "I am Emma, sir. That is Jacob and Joshua. They are the troublemakers." The twins protested this characterization loudly. "And Sarah over there, and Thomas, and the baby, is Margaret." "Well, that is a fine group of children," Mason said seriously, addressing them as though they were adults. "I brought some supplies that your mother is going to turn into a proper meal. But first, I need to know, are any of you good at fence mending?" Jacob's hand shot up. "I am, sir. I am real good with my hands." "That is what I like to hear. How about you and your brother come help me after we get these supplies put away? Your mother can put us to work properly." The boys practically vibrated with excitement. Male attention, male approval. These were things that had been missing from their lives for too long, and Teresa felt a pang of guilt that she could not be everything her children needed. But there was no time for guilt now. Mason was already showing Emma where to store the flour and beans, his voice patient as he explained how to keep weevils out of the grain. Teresa set Margaret down in her cradle with a strip of dried apple to gum on a luxury that made the baby's eyes widen, and began sorting through the supplies with shaking hands. There was enough here for a week of decent meals, maybe more if she was careful. Salt pork could flavor beans for days. The dried apples could be stewed or baked into something sweet. And the flour-blessed flour could make bread, real bread, not the tough corn cakes they had been surviving on. "Mr. Rhodes," she began, but he interrupted her gently. "Just Mason, please, madam. Mr. Rhodes was my father." "Mason, then. This is too much. I cannot possibly—" "You are not taking anything," Mason said firmly. "I am trading, fair labor for fair compensation. Now, if you will excuse me, I have 2 young men waiting to learn about fence mending." He was out the door before Teresa could formulate another protest, the twins scrambling after him like eager puppies. Through the window, she watched them trail Mason to the fence line, saw how he crouched down to their level to explain something, how he handed each of them a tool and showed them how to use it properly. "Mama, is he going to stay?" Sarah had crept close, her small hand slipping into Teresa's. "Just for a few days, sweetheart." "I like him," Sarah said simply. "He has kind eyes." Teresa looked out the window again at Mason Rhodes, who was laughing at something Joshua had said, his whole face open and genuine. Sarah was right. He did have kind eyes. She turned back to the supplies and began planning a meal, something that would fill 6 small bellies and maybe, just maybe, prove to this unexpected stranger that she was worth the help he was offering. The beans went into a pot with some of the salt pork, water from the well, and a precious pinch of the salt Mason had brought. While they cooked, Teresa mixed flour and water and a little lard into dough, her hands remembering the rhythm of bread making, even though it had been months since she had enough flour to practice. Emma watched carefully, learning, always learning, preparing for the day when she would have to do these things herself. "Can you really make bread, Mama?" Emma asked, wonder in her voice. "I can, and I will teach you so you remember how it is done." They worked together in comfortable silence, the kind that came from shared labor and shared love. Thomas played at their feet, building towers from wooden blocks, and Margaret dozed in her cradle, her belly fuller than it had been in weeks, thanks to that strip of dried apple. By the time the sun had moved to its zenith, the house smelled like baking bread, and Teresa had transformed Mason's supplies into a meal that made her own stomach growl with anticipation. She stepped outside to call the workers in and found that the fence had been not just mended, but reinforced, with new posts driven deep into the hard earth. Mason stood back, surveying the work with satisfaction, while the twins chattered at him about everything and nothing, their voices high with excitement. When they saw Teresa, all three looked up with matching expressions of pride. "Look, Mama, we fixed it," Jacob called out. "We did it all ourselves," Joshua added, which was certainly an exaggeration, but Teresa smiled anyway. "I can see that. You boys did fine work. Now come wash up, dinner is ready." The twins raced for the water pump, and Mason followed more slowly, his shirt damp with sweat and dust coating his arms. He washed carefully and thoroughly, and Teresa found herself noticing the strength in his forearms, the capable sureness of his movements. "Smells wonderful," Mason said, and the simple compliment warmed her more than it should have. They ate at the rough wooden table, 8 people crowded around a space meant for 6, and it should have been uncomfortable, but somehow it was not. The children were on their best behavior, awed by the presence of a guest and the abundance of actual food on their plates. Mason told stories between bites, nothing improper, just tales of his travels, the places he had seen, the people he had met. He had been born in Texas, he said, on a ranch that had not survived the hard years after the war. His parents had died of cholera when he was 16, and he had been on his own ever since, working cattle drives, doing ranch work, taking whatever honest labor he could find. He was heading to the border country now because he had heard there was work on the big ranches down there, breaking horses and managing cattle. "Do you like it?" Emma asked, moving around all the time. Mason considered this seriously before answering. "It has its moments. You see a lot of country, meet interesting folks, but I would be lying if I said I did not sometimes wish for a place to settle, somewhere to call home." His eyes met Teresa's across the table when he said this, and something passed between them, some acknowledgement of shared loneliness that made her heart beat faster. After the meal, Mason insisted on helping clean up, which scandalized Emma's sense of proper gender roles, but pleased Teresa more than she wanted to admit. They worked side by side at the wash basin, and Teresa found herself acutely aware of his presence, the warmth radiating from his body in the close quarters of the kitchen, the brush of his hand against hers when he passed her a plate to dry. "You have done a remarkable job with those children," Mason said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "They are well-mannered and kind. That does not happen by accident." "They are good children," Teresa said, deflecting the compliment because she did not know how to accept it. "They have had to grow up faster than they should have. Still, it speaks to their mother." Teresa felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature of the wash water. She changed the subject quickly. "You do not have to stay in the barn, you know. It is not proper, perhaps, but we have a spare room. It is small, but it has a real bed." Mason was quiet for a long moment. "I would not want to compromise your reputation, madam. A widow woman with children needs to be careful about such things." "This is Haycheetah, not Boston," Teresa said dryly. "And anyone who has something to say about me providing shelter to a man who is helping keep my children fed can keep their opinions to themselves. In that case, I accept gratefully. The barn is fine for sleeping, but I would be lying if I said my back did not appreciate the offer of a real bed." They finished the dishes in companionable silence, and then Mason excused himself to tend to his horses while Teresa put the children to bed. It was a lengthy process, as it always was. Sarah needed her hair braided. The twins needed to be separated and then settled. Thomas needed a song, and Margaret needed to be rocked. Emma helped with all of it, as she always did, and Teresa felt the familiar ache of knowing that her eldest daughter had sacrificed too much of her childhood already. "I like Mr. Rhodes," Emma whispered as she climbed into the bed she shared with Sarah. "Do you think he will really stay a few days?" "He said he would." "Good." Emma smiled sleepily. "It is nice having a man around again. It feels more like a family." The words stabbed at Teresa's heart, but she simply kissed her daughter's forehead and moved on to check the boys, who were already asleep, sprawled in their shared bed like puppies in a pile. Thomas slept in a small cot nearby, his thumb in his mouth, and Margaret had finally settled in her cradle, 6 hungry mouths, all fed and sleeping peacefully. The sight brought tears to Teresa's eyes, and she had to step outside to compose herself before Mason saw her crying. But Mason was standing in the yard, looking up at the stars that blazed across the New Mexico sky with such brilliance that they seemed close enough to touch. He heard her step and turned, and in the moonlight his face was kind and open. "Beautiful night," he said. "Yes." Teresa moved to stand beside him, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough to smell the clean scent of him. Soap and leather and something else she could not quite name. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for today. For all of it. You do not need to thank me." "I do, though. You have no idea what it means, what you have done. Those children have not eaten that well in months, and the boys," her voice caught, "they have not had a man pay attention to them like that since their father died. It matters more than you could know." Mason turned to face her fully, and his expression was serious now, intense in a way that made Teresa's breath catch. "Tell me about him. Your husband." "James." The name still hurt to say, even after 3 years. "He was a good man, gentle, hard-working. We came out here from Missouri, thinking we would make a new start. He built this house with his own hands, started the chicken business, talked about getting cattle someday." She smiled sadly. "He always had big plans. How did he die?" "Fever. It swept through town 3 summers ago. Took him and a dozen others in the space of 2 weeks. I was pregnant with Margaret at the time, and after she was born." Teresa stopped, not wanting to burden this stranger with the full weight of her struggles. "It has been hard." "I can imagine." Mason's voice was gentle. "Or actually, I cannot imagine. I have never had that kind of responsibility, those kinds of stakes. What you have done, keeping those children alive and together, that is real courage. I had no choice." "There is always a choice," Mason said. "You could have given them up, sent them to orphanages or to relatives. No one would have blamed you, but you kept them, kept fighting. That is not nothing, Teresa." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent a shiver through her, despite the warm night air. "I should get some rest," she said, suddenly flustered by his nearness and the intensity of his gaze. "Tomorrow will be another long day." "Of course." Mason stepped back, giving her space. "Sleep well, Teresa." She fled inside, her heart pounding, and lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of her children, breathing in sleep and wondering what on earth she was doing, letting herself feel anything for a man who would be gone in a few days. But when morning came, Mason was still there, already up and feeding the chickens, humming tunelessly as he worked. Teresa watched him from the window as she nursed Margaret, and something that felt dangerously like hope began to bloom in her chest. The days that followed fell into a pattern that felt both strange and wonderful. Mason worked from dawn to dusk, finding a seemingly endless list of repairs and improvements that needed doing. He fixed the pump that had been sticking for months. He reinforced the chicken coop against predators. He rode into town and somehow charmed the general store owner into extending credit, coming back with supplies Teresa desperately needed, but had been too proud to ask for. In the evenings, they would all eat together, and then Mason would help the children with their lessons. Emma was learning to read, and Mason had a patience with her stumbling efforts that made Teresa's heart ache. He taught the twins to whittle, producing pocket knives and showing them how to shape wood without cutting themselves. He let Sarah climb into his lap during story time, her small head resting against his chest, and bounced Thomas on his knee until the little boy shrieked with laughter. And every night, after the children were in bed, Teresa and Mason would sit outside under the stars and talk. They talked about everything and nothing, their pasts, their dreams, the small observations of the day. Mason made her laugh with his dry wit and his stories of misadventures on the trail. Teresa found herself opening up in ways she had not in years, sharing fears and hopes she had thought she would never voice aloud. "What do you want?" Mason asked her one night, perhaps a week into his stay. "If you could have anything, what would it be?" Teresa thought about this carefully. "I want my children to have enough to eat. I want them to be safe, to have opportunities, to grow up without so much fear and struggle. I want—" She stopped, not sure she dared say the rest. "What?" Mason prompted gently. "I want to not be alone anymore," Teresa whispered. "Is that selfish? I have the children, and I love them more than life itself, but it is not the same as having a partner, someone to share the burden and the joy with. I miss that. I miss having someone who is just mine, who chooses me not out of obligation, but out of want." Mason was quiet for a long moment, and Teresa felt heat flood her face. She had said too much, revealed too much. He probably thought she was pathetic, a desperate widow throwing herself at any man who showed her kindness. But when Mason finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "You are the least selfish person I have ever met, Teresa Bennett, and any man who has you choose him would be the luckiest person alive." Their eyes met in the moonlight, and Teresa saw something in Mason's face that made her breath catch longing, tenderness, and something deeper that she was afraid to name. "Mason," she began, but he stood abruptly. "I should check on the horses," he said, his voice strained. "Good night, Teresa." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her sitting alone in the darkness, her heart pounding and her mind racing. Something had shifted between them. Some line had been crossed, and Teresa did not know if she should be terrified or thrilled. The next morning brought trouble in the form of Silas Hogarth, the banker from town. He arrived in a buggy, overdressed for the heat in a suit that had seen better days, his expression one of barely concealed disdain as he surveyed Teresa's property. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I have come to discuss your outstanding debts." Teresa felt her stomach drop. She had been avoiding thinking about the money she owed, the loans James had taken out to buy the property and stock it, the credit she had extended at the general store. It was a weight that pressed on her constantly, but there had been nothing she could do about it. "I am aware of my debts, Mr. Hogarth. I am doing everything I can to—" "Your everything is not sufficient," Hogarth interrupted. "You are 3 months behind on your loan payments, Mrs. Bennett. The bank cannot continue to carry you indefinitely." "I just need more time. The chickens are starting to lay better, and—" "Chickens," Hogarth's voice dripped with contempt. "You think you can pay off a $200 loan with egg money? Be reasonable, woman. $200. It might as well have been 2,000. Teresa felt the world tilt sickeningly around her. "What are you saying?" she asked, though she already knew. "I am saying that unless you can make a significant payment within the next 2 weeks, the bank will be forced to foreclose. The property will be sold to cover your debts, and you and your children will need to make other arrangements." "But this is our home!" The words burst from Teresa, raw with desperation. "Those children have nowhere else to go. You cannot—" "I can, and I will, unless you can pay." Hogarth started to turn away, then paused. "Though there is another option, if you are willing to be practical about things." Something in his tone made Teresa's skin crawl. "What option?" "You are still a young woman, Mrs. Bennett, and not unattractive despite your circumstances. I am a widower myself, and I have need of someone to manage my household. If you were willing to accept my hand in marriage, I would be willing to forgive your debts and provide for your children." The offer hung in the air like something rotten. Teresa stared at Silas Hogarth, at his cold eyes and thin lips, and felt revulsion wash through her. "I would rather lose everything," she said quietly. "Then you will," Hogarth replied, not seeming particularly bothered by her rejection. 2 weeks, Mrs. Bennett. That is all the time you have." He climbed back into his buggy and drove away, leaving Teresa standing in the yard with her world crumbling around her. 2 weeks, $200. It was impossible. There was no way she could raise that kind of money in such a short time. She did not realize she was crying until strong hands gripped her shoulders gently, and she looked up to find Mason standing in front of her, his face tight with concern. "I heard," he said simply. "Teresa, I am so sorry." "What am I going to do?" The question came out as a broken whisper. "Where will we go? How will I keep the children together? Hey now! Mason pulled her into his arms, and Teresa went without resistance, pressing her face against his chest and letting herself break down in a way she had not allowed herself to in 3 years. He held her through it, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring soothing nonsense words until the storm of tears passed. "I will not let you lose this place," Mason said when she finally pulled back, wiping at her eyes. "We will figure something out." "There is nothing to figure out. I do not have $200, and there is no way to get it in 2 weeks. It is over." "It is not over." Mason's voice was firm, decisive. "I have some money saved, about $80. It is not enough to cover the whole debt, but it is a start." Teresa jerked back, staring at him in shock. "I cannot take your money. Mason, that is your stake, your future. You need that for when you settle somewhere, when I find a place to call home?" Mason cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Teresa, I have found it. I found it the moment I rode into your yard and saw a woman brave enough and strong enough to keep fighting even when everything was stacked against her. I found it in the sound of those children laughing, in the taste of your cooking, in the feeling of waking up every morning knowing I have a purpose beyond just surviving another day. Mason, you cannot mean... I mean every word." His thumbs brushed away her tears with infinite gentleness. "I have been falling in love with you since the moment you said you had 6 hungry mouths and I said we would feed them together. These past weeks have been the happiest of my life, and I will be damned if I let some pompous banker take that away from us." "Us?" Teresa could barely breathe, could barely think past the thundering of her heart. "Us," Mason confirmed, "if you will have me. I know I am just a drifter with no prospects and more hope than sense, but I love you, Teresa. I love your strength and your courage and the way you put everyone else first, even when you are breaking under the weight. I love how you smile at your children and how you look at the stars like you are making wishes. I love everything about you, and I want to stay. I want to help raise those children and feed those hungry mouths and build a life with you, if you will let me." Teresa could not speak past the lump in her throat, so she did the only thing she could think of. She kissed him. It was clumsy and desperate and perfect, and when they broke apart, both breathing hard, Mason was smiling that beautiful warm smile that had captured her heart from the very beginning. "I will take that as a yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Teresa managed to say. "Yes to all of it. But Mason, your money alone will not be enough. We still need another $120, and I have no idea where that is going to come from. Then we get creative." Mason took her hand, his grip strong and sure. "We have 2 weeks. Let us see what we can do." What they did over the next 13 days was work harder than Teresa had thought humanly possible. Mason took on every odd job he could find in town, shoeing horses, hauling freight, repairing buildings. Teresa ramped up her egg production, taking the freshest eggs into town every morning to sell. Emma watched the younger children while her mother worked, taking on responsibilities that should not have belonged to a 9-year-old, but that she bore with remarkable grace. Word spread through Hachita about the widow Bennett situation, and to Teresa's amazement, people began to help. The general store owner's wife bought extra eggs, paying above market price. The blacksmith hired Mason for more work than he really needed done. Even Father Rodriguez from the Catholic Church stopped by with a donation from the congregation's poor box, pressing $5 precious into Teresa's hand and refusing to take no for an answer. "We take care of our own," he said simply. "You have been part of this community for years, Teresa. Let us help you." By the end of the first week, they had raised another $40. It was progress, but not nearly enough. Teresa lay awake at night doing calculations in her head, trying to figure out how to squeeze blood from a stone, and beside her, because after his declaration, there had seemed no point in maintaining separate bedrooms, Mason would pull her close and whisper assurances that everything would work out. On the 10th day, salvation came from an unexpected source. A rancher from up north, a man named Augustus White, who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of cattle, rode into Hachita looking for a horsebreaker. Someone directed him to Mason, who had gained a reputation around town for his skill with difficult animals. "I have got 20 green horses that need breaking," White said, his manner all business. "If you can do it in a week, I will pay you $50. $50. It was more than Mason could make in a month of odd jobs. But Teresa saw the hesitation in his face. saw him glance back toward the house where the children were playing. "That is quite a lot of horses in very little time," Mason said carefully. "It is why I am paying so well, but if you cannot do it, I will find someone who can." "He can do it," Teresa said, stepping forward before Mason could decline. "Mason Rhodes is the best horse breaker in New Mexico. He will have your horses ready in a week." White looked between them, then nodded. "All right then, my ranch is a half-day's ride north. Can you start tomorrow?" "He will be there," Teresa confirmed. After White left, Mason turned to her with concern written all over his face. "Teresa, that means I will be gone for a week. I will have to stay at his ranch to work those horses properly. Are you sure you can manage without me?" "We managed for 3 years before you came along," Teresa said, though her heart ached at the thought of him leaving. "We can manage for 1 week, especially if it means keeping our home." "Our home," Mason repeated, pulling her close. "I like the sound of that." He left the next morning, kissing Teresa goodbye in front of God and the children and everyone, staking his claim for all to see. The twins cried, Sarah clung to his leg, and even Emma looked close to tears. But Mason promised he would be back in 7 days, and he promised to bring them something special when he came. The week that followed was the longest of Teresa's life. She threw herself into work, into caring for the children, into anything that would keep her from counting the hours until Mason returned. Emma was a godsend, taking on even more responsibility without complaint. The twins were helpful when they remembered to be, and Sarah tried so hard to be good that it broke Teresa's heart. On the 6th day, another dust devil swept through the yard, and Teresa found herself thinking about that morning 3 weeks ago, when Mason had ridden into her life. It felt like a lifetime ago, like she had been a completely different person, harder, more closed off, resigned to struggle and loneliness. Now she had hope. Real, tangible hope, and the knowledge that she was loved, that someone had chosen her and her children, despite all the complications and difficulties. On the morning of the 7th day, Teresa was up before dawn, unable to sleep, watching the road for any sign of a rider. The children joined her one by one, everyone too excited to stay in bed. When Mason finally appeared on the horizon, the twins let out whoops of joy and raced down the road to meet him. But it was not just Mason riding toward them. Augustus White rode beside him, and both men were smiling. Teresa's heart began to pound. Something had happened, something beyond just the completion of the job. She could see it in the way Mason sat his horse, in the triumphant gleam in his eye. They dismounted in the yard, and Mason swept Teresa into his arms, spinning her around while the children laughed and danced with excitement. "I did it," he said when he finally set her down. "All 20 horses, broken and ready for work. Mr. White here is so pleased that he is paying me $60 instead of $50. $60. Combined with what they had already saved, it would be enough. Just barely, but enough." "There is more," Augustus White said, speaking up. "Rhodes here has a real gift with horses. I would like to offer him steady work as my head horse breaker, with a monthly salary of $35 plus housing." Teresa felt the world tilt again, but this time with joy instead of fear. $35 a month was more money than James had ever made, more than she had dared dream possible. "Housing," Mason asked carefully. "There is a foreman's cottage on my land that has been sitting empty since my last man moved on. It has got 3 bedrooms, a real wood floor, and a pump right in the kitchen. You and your family would be welcome to it." Your family. The words hung in the air, an acknowledgement of the unconventional family they had formed. Mason turned to Teresa, his expression making it clear that the decision was hers as much as his. "What do you think? It would mean leaving this place, but—" "This place was James's dream," Teresa said slowly, working through her thoughts out loud. "And I loved him, and I love what we built here, but he is gone, and clinging to the past is not going to feed our children or give them a future, a new start, a fresh beginning. Maybe that is exactly what we need." "Are you sure?" Mason's hands gripped hers tightly. "I am sure." Teresa looked at her children, at their hopeful faces, and then back at Mason. "Wherever you are, that is home now. The rest is just details." The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. They paid off Teresa's debts, giving Silas Hogarth his $200 and having the enormous satisfaction of seeing his face when Teresa informed him she would not need his generous offer of marriage. They sold the property to a young couple just starting out, a transaction that Father Rodriguez helped broker to ensure Teresa got a fair price, And through it all, Mason was there, steady and sure, making plans and dreaming dreams with her. They would move to the White Ranch in early September, he said. He would start his job, and she would keep house and maybe take in some sewing or laundry to bring in extra money. The children would go to the school that was only 2 miles from the ranch, close enough that they could walk in good weather. It would be a good life, a full life. There is one thing, though, Mason said the night before they were set to leave Hachita. They were sitting outside under the stars one last time, the children asleep inside, the house nearly empty of their possessions. What is that? I think we should get married, properly I mean, before we move. I know we have been living as though we are already married, and in my heart, we are. But I want to do this right, Teresa. I want those children to have my name, and I want the world to know that you are mine and I am yours. Teresa felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. Are you proposing to me, Mason Rhodes? I suppose I am. He dropped to one knee there in the dust, taking her hand in his. Teresa Bennett, will you marry me? Will you let me be a husband to you and a father to those 6 beautiful children? Will you build a life with me and grow old beside me and let me love you for all the days I have left? Yes, Teresa said, laughing through her tears. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. They were married 2 days later in the Catholic Church, with Father Rodriguez officiating and half of Hachita in attendance. Teresa wore a dress borrowed from the store owner's wife, simple white cotton that made her feel like a bride again. Emma and Sarah wore matching dresses that the church ladies had sewn, and the boys were scrubbed within an inch of their lives, their hair slicked down, and their best shirts buttoned up tight. Mason stood at the altar looking nervous and proud, and so handsome that Teresa's heart skipped a beat when she walked down the aisle toward him. When Father Rodriguez asked if anyone objected to the union, the church was silent except for baby Margaret's cheerful babbling, and when Mason kissed his bride, the children cheered and the congregation laughed, and Teresa knew that this was the beginning of something beautiful. They moved to the White Ranch the next week, packing up their belongings in a wagon Augustus White had lent them for the journey. The cottage he had promised turned out to be even better than described sturdy adobe construction, with real glass windows, 3 generous bedrooms, and that miraculous indoor pump that made Teresa want to weep with gratitude. The children adapted to their new life with the resilience of youth. Emma flourished at the nearby school, revealing a sharp mind that her teacher praised effusively. The twins discovered a love of animals, spending every free moment in the stables, learning everything they could from Mason. Sarah came out of her shell, making friends with other ranch children, and laughing more than Teresa had heard in years. Thomas started talking in full sentences, mimicking everything Mason said, and Margaret took her first steps while reaching for her new father. Because that was what Mason had become, not a stepfather or a substitute, but simply their father. He loved those children with a fierceness that took Teresa's breath away, attending to their needs and their hearts with equal dedication. He taught the boys to ride and rope. He read bedtime stories until his voice went hoarse. He dried tears and dispensed advice and showed up to every school event and every small triumph. And with Teresa, he was everything she had never dared hope for. He was patient and passionate, tender and strong, making her laugh during the days and holding her close through the nights. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, building the kind of intimacy that came from truly knowing another person. He never made her feel less than or incapable, instead, treating her as a partner in every decision. The work was hard, ranch life always was, but it was good work, purposeful work. Mason broke horses with a skill that made Augustus White brag to anyone who would listen about his head horse breaker. Teresa kept their home warm and welcoming, and took in sewing from the other ranch wives, bringing in extra money that they carefully saved. By Christmas of 1882, they had saved enough to buy their own horse, a mare that Mason intended to breed. By spring of 1883, Teresa discovered she was pregnant with their first child together, news that made Mason whoop with joy, and made the 6 children argue enthusiastically about whether they wanted a brother or a sister. "As long as it is healthy, I do not care which," Teresa said, though privately she hoped for a boy who would have Mason's dark eyes and steady temperament. The pregnancy progressed without complications, Teresa's body apparently pleased to be carrying a child when she was not also starving and terrified. Mason was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly asking if she needed anything, if she was comfortable, if she should be resting more. "I have had 6 children already," Teresa reminded him with amusement. "I know how this works." "But this is our child," Mason said, his hand splayed possessively over her growing belly. "That makes it different." Their son was born in November of 1883, a healthy baby with a lusty cry and his father's dark hair. They named him Matthew Rhodes, and Mason cried when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed with the enormity of being a father from the very beginning. The other children doted on baby Matthew with a devotion that was almost comical. Emma appointed herself assistant mother, helping with every feeding and diaper change. The twins were convinced their new brother was the most remarkable baby ever born and would spend hours just watching him sleep. Sarah sang to him constantly, her sweet voice soothing Matthew through his fussy moments. Thomas, now 4 years old, took his role as big brother seriously, bringing Matthew toys and patting his head with careful gentleness. Even Margaret, barely 3 herself, would try to help, offering her own worn dolls for the baby to play with. Life settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and joyful. The years passed with the quick fluidity of happiness, marked by birthdays and holidays and the small triumphs of children growing. Emma grew into a beautiful young woman, graduating from school with honors and catching the eye of the school teacher's nephew. The twins discovered a talent for working with cattle, becoming indispensable ranch hands by the time they were teenagers. Sarah inherited her mother's skill with a needle, creating beautiful embroidered pieces that sold for good prices in town. Thomas showed an aptitude for numbers, keeping accounts for the ranch store with meticulous accuracy. Margaret became the ranch's unofficial veterinarian, with an uncanny ability to soothe sick or injured animals. Mason and Teresa had 2 more children, a daughter named Melissa in 1885, and another son, Martin, in 1888. Each new baby was celebrated as the miracle they were, welcomed into a family that had more than enough love to go around. Augustus White proved to be not just an employer, but a friend, someone who valued Mason's skills and Teresa's contributions to the ranch community. When White's health began to fail in 1890, he offered to sell Mason a portion of the ranch land at a price they could manage with their savings and a reasonable loan. "You have made this place better," White said simply. "You should have a stake in it." They became landowners then, not just employees, but partners in the ranch's success. Mason built them a larger house on their new property, one with 5 bedrooms and a proper parlor and a kitchen that made Teresa sigh with contentment every time she walked into it. They bought more horses and started breeding them, developing a reputation for quality animals that spread throughout New Mexico and beyond. By 1892, 10 years after that fateful morning, when Mason had ridden into Teresa's yard, they had transformed from desperate strangers into a family that was woven into the very fabric of the community. Their children were happy and healthy, growing into capable adults with bright futures. Their business was thriving, providing not just for their own family, but employment for others. And their love, which had started in desperation and practicality, had deepened into something profound and unshakable. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Teresa asked one night as they sat on the porch of their new house, watching the sun set over land that was theirs. "If you had ridden past that morning, if you had not stopped to help with that chicken?" Mason pulled her closer, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest, where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "And then I thank God every day that I did stop, that I met you, that you gave me a chance." "I gave you a chance?" Teresa laughed. "You saved us, Mason. You saved my children and you saved me, and you did it with nothing but kindness and determination and love." "We saved each other," Mason corrected gently. "You gave me a home, Teresa. You gave me purpose and family and a reason to stop drifting and start living. Every good thing in my life comes from that morning when you told me you had 6 hungry mouths and I said we would feed them together." 7 hungry mouths now," Teresa said, smiling. "Matthew is eating as much as the twins these days. And Melissa is not far behind," Mason added with amusement. Their daughter had inherited her mother's appetite and her father's metabolism, growing like a weed despite eating her weight in food every day. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. From inside the house came the sounds of their family children arguing playfully over a game. Baby Martin's gurgling laugh, the clatter of dishes as Emma helped clear the dinner table. "I love you," Teresa said, as she did every night, the words never losing their power or meaning. "I love you too," Mason replied, as he always did, his voice full of the same wonder he had felt on that first day. "Forever, Teresa. You and me and all those hungry mouths, forever." The years continued to unfold with their mixture of challenges and joys. Emma married her schoolteacher at 20, a kind man named Daniel Foster, who loved her with the devotion she deserved. They built a home nearby and soon blessed Teresa and Mason with their first grandchild, a little girl named Rose, who had Emma's eyes and Daniel's smile. The twins, inseparable as always, both found work on a large ranch in Texas, where they quickly made names for themselves as expert cattlemen. They wrote home regularly, their letters full of adventure and mischief, promising to return for visits whenever they could. Sarah opened a dressmaking shop in town, her designs becoming sought after by ladies throughout the territory. She lived above her shop, independent and content, though Teresa suspected there was a certain blacksmith who was working up the courage to court her properly. Thomas, their numbers genius, was recruited by a bank in Santa Fe, offered a position as an accountant at a salary that made even Augustus White whistle with appreciation. He moved to the city but came home every few months, always bearing gifts for his younger siblings, and tales of urban life that fascinated and bewildered the family in equal measure. Margaret, true to her calling, became the region's most trusted animal doctor, despite having no formal training. People brought their sick horses and cattle from miles around, knowing that Margaret Rhodes could work miracles that even trained veterinarians could not match. She showed no interest in marriage, declaring that animals were far less complicated than men, though she said it with a smile that took any sting from the words. Matthew grew into a young man who was the perfect blend of his parents, his mother's kindness, and his father's steady strength. He took to horse breeding like he had been born to it, developing an eye for bloodlines and conformation that rivaled Mason's own expertise. Melissa became the family's musician, somehow teaching herself to play the piano that Mason had bought from a family moving back east. Her music filled the house with beauty, and she performed at every community gathering, her talent bringing joy to all who heard her. And Martin, their youngest, was still finding his way, but showed signs of being as curious and adventurous as his older siblings. Through it all, Mason and Teresa remained the steady center of their family universe. They worked side by side, day after day, year after year, building not just a business, but a legacy. The Rhodes Ranch became known throughout New Mexico for its quality horses, its honest dealings, and its generous employers who treated their workers like family. When Augustus White finally passed away in 1895, he left Mason and Teresa the remainder of the ranch in his will, having no children of his own and considering them the closest thing to family he had. It was an inheritance that came with enormous responsibility, but also the satisfaction of knowing they had earned it through years of hard work and loyalty. By the turn of the century, as the 1800s gave way to 1900, and the Wild West began to be tamed by railroads and telegraph lines and all the trappings of modern civilization, Mason and Teresa could look back on nearly 20 years of marriage with profound satisfaction. They had raised 9 children, 6 who had come with Teresa, and 3 they had made together, and all of them were thriving, finding their own paths in the world while remaining connected to the family that had formed them. On a warm evening in June of 1902, the entire family gathered at the ranch for Emma's 30th birthday. 3 generations of Rhodes filled the house and spilled out into the yard, children and grandchildren, in-laws and friends, all united by the bonds that Mason and Teresa had forged all those years ago. Mason stood at the edge of the celebration, watching his family with eyes that still misted with gratitude after all this time. Teresa found him there, as she always did, slipping her hand into his with the ease of 2 decades of practice. "Quite a crowd," she said, surveying the gathering with satisfaction. "Hard to believe it all started with 6 hungry mouths and a stranger on a horse." "Best decision I ever made," Mason said, pulling her close. "Stopping to help the chicken escape." Teresa laughed, the sound as bright and beautiful as it had been when she was 24 and desperate and brave enough to accept help from a stranger. "The chicken was just an excuse. You would have found a reason to stop anyway." "You are probably right," Mason admitted. "There was something about you, even in that first moment. Like I recognized you somehow. Like my soul knew yours. Listen to you, getting poetic in your old age." Teresa leaned into him, still fitting perfectly against his side after all these years. "I am only 47. That is not old. Tell that to your gray hairs. Teresa reached up to touch the silver that had started threading through Mason's dark hair, distinguished marks of time and experience. You have a few of your own, Mason pointed out, but his voice was tender, loving every line and mark that the years had given her. They watched their family together, seeing the fruits of their labor and their love playing out before them. Emma was laughing with her husband while their children played at their feet. The twins had made it home for the celebration, looking sun-weathered and happy, entertaining a rapt audience with stories of their adventures. Sarah was indeed being courted by that blacksmith, Teresa noted with maternal satisfaction, the two of them sitting close together on the porch steps. Thomas held little Martin on his shoulders, pointing out constellations in the darkening sky. Margaret was teaching Melissa some complicated tune on the piano, their heads bent together in concentration. And Matthew was everywhere at once, making sure everyone had food and drink, already developing the hospitality and leadership that would serve him well as he took on more responsibility for the ranch. "We did good," Mason said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "We did very good," Teresa agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible, that morning when you rode into my yard." "Do you remember what I said?" Mason asked. "When you told me you had 6 hungry mouths? You said, 'Then let's feed them together.'" Teresa smiled at the memory. "And you did, Mason. We did. We fed them and clothed them and loved them, and now look at them. Look at what we built." "Best partnership I ever entered into," Mason said, then paused. "Actually, the only partnership I ever entered into, but definitely the best." Teresa laughed again, and the sound drew the attention of their children. Emma looked over and smiled, seeing her mother happy in her father's arms. The twins raised their glasses in a toast to their parents. Sarah blew them a kiss, and one by one, the entire family turned to look at Mason and Teresa, at the couple who had brought them all together, who had created this impossible, beautiful family out of desperation and determination and love. "Speech!" someone called out, and others took up the chant until Mason raised his hands in surrender. All right," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "I am not much for speeches, as you all know, but I will say this. 20 years ago, I rode into a yard in Hachita, and I met a woman who changed my life. She had 6 children who needed raising and not much else besides courage and determination. And I fell in love, not just with her, but with all of them, with the family they were and the family we could become together." He pulled Teresa even closer, his arm tight around her waist. "Teresa, you made me a husband and a father. You gave me a home when I had been drifting for so long I had forgotten what home meant. You taught me what real strength looks like, what real love requires. Everything good in my life, everything I am proud of, exists because you let me into your life and your heart." There was not a dry eye in the yard now, and Teresa herself was crying freely, not caring who saw. "And to all of you," Mason continued, addressing the children and grandchildren gathered around them, "you are my greatest accomplishment. Not the ranch, not the horses, not the business success, you. Every single one of you. You make me proud every day, and I thank God that I get to be your father." The family erupted into applause and cheers, and then they were surrounded, pulled into hugs and kisses and exclamations of love. The celebration continued late into the night, filled with music and laughter and the kind of joy that comes from being truly, completely loved. When everyone had finally gone home or bedded down for the night, Mason and Teresa found themselves alone once more, sitting on the porch of the house they had built together, under stars that had witnessed every moment of their journey. 20 more years, Teresa said softly. "Do you think we will get 20 more?" "If we are lucky," Mason replied, "and I have been very lucky indeed." "I want to grow old with you," Teresa said, voicing a desire that had lived in her heart since those early days when she had not dared speak it aloud. "I want to see our grandchildren grow up, maybe meet our great-grandchildren. I want decades more of this, of us, of the life we have built." "Then that is what we will have," Mason promised, speaking with the same confidence he had shown all those years ago when he had promised to help feed 6 hungry mouths. "Whatever time we get, Teresa, we will fill it with love and family and all the things that matter." They sat together until the stars wheeled overhead and the night grew cool, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something extraordinary from the ruins of desperation and the seeds of hope. The Rhodes family continued to grow and thrive as the new century unfolded, more grandchildren were born, then great-grandchildren, each one welcomed into the family with the same fierce love that had characterized Mason and Teresa's relationship from the beginning. The ranch prospered through hard times and good, weathering droughts and economic downturns through careful management, and the kind of resilience that Mason and Teresa had learned in those early desperate days. Mason and Teresa did get their 20 more years, and then some. They grew old together with grace, their love deepening with each passing season. Mason's hair went completely silver, and Teresa's face grew lined with laugh lines and crow's feet, marks of a life well lived and joy frequently expressed. They moved a bit slower, worked a bit less, but remained the beating heart of their family, the foundation upon which everything else was built. On a spring morning in 1925, 43 years after Mason had ridden into that chicken yard in Hachita, Teresa woke to find him watching her with the same tender expression he had worn on their wedding day. "What are you looking at?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. "Just counting my blessings," Mason replied. "Every morning I wake up next to you is a blessing." "Sweet talker," Teresa said, but she smiled as she said it. They rose together and went through the morning routine they had perfected over decades, Mason starting the coffee while Teresa made breakfast, the two of them moving around each other with the practiced ease of long partnership. Their children and grandchildren would be arriving later for Sunday dinner, as they did every week, and there was much to prepare. But first, they took their coffee out to the porch, sitting in the rockers Mason had built years ago, watching the sun rise over land that had been touched by their hands and shaped by their dreams. "I have been thinking," Teresa said after a comfortable silence, "about that morning when you stopped to help with the chicken." "You think about that a lot," Mason observed with amusement. "Because it changed everything," Teresa said simply. "One small moment, one small kindness, and my entire life changed. Our children's lives changed. All those grandchildren and great-grandchildren, none of them would exist if you had just ridden past." "The universe works in mysterious ways," Mason said. "Maybe it was always meant to happen that morning. Maybe I was always meant to find you, and you were always meant to let me stay." "Do you believe that?" Teresa asked. "In fate? In things being meant to be?" Mason considered this seriously, as he always did when Teresa asked him something important. "I believe that we make our own fate, most of the time. We choose to stop or ride past, to help or ignore, to love or close our hearts. But I also believe that some things, some people, are meant to find each other. And when they do, when you recognize that person as your person, you hold on tight and you do the work to make it last." "We did do the work," Teresa said softly. "It was not always easy." "No," Mason agreed, "but it was always worth it." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, illuminating the ranch that had been their home and their legacy. In the distance, they could see horses grazing in the pasture descendants of that first mare they had bought so many years ago, bloodlines they had carefully cultivated into something remarkable. Closer by, the garden Teresa had planted was beginning to bloom with the vibrant colors of spring. "I love you," Teresa said, as she had said 10,000 times before, the words never losing their meaning or their power. "I love you too," Mason replied, as he always did, his voice full of the same certainty and devotion it had carried 43 years ago. 6 hungry mouths, and a cowboy dumb enough to think he could help feed them. "Not dumb," Teresa corrected gently. "Brave, kind, the best man I have ever known." "The luckiest man who ever lived," Mason said, reaching over to take her hand. They sat together as the morning unfolded around them, two people who had started with nothing but determination and love, and had built an empire of family and legacy. When their children and grandchildren began arriving later that morning, they would find Mason and Teresa exactly where they always were together, side by side, still feeding those hungry mouths and all the others that had come along, still building the dream they had started that dusty morning in Hachita, when a desperate widow met a wandering cowboy, and both of them found exactly what they had been searching for. The story of their love would be told and retold through generations, becoming the foundation myth of the Rhodes family, how Grandma Teresa had been at her lowest point, how Grandpa Mason had stopped to help, how they had looked at an impossible situation and decided to face it together, how 6 hungry mouths became 7, then 8, then 9, and eventually dozens as the family grew and prospered, how love and determination and partnership could transform desperation into dynasty, loneliness into legacy. And always, at the center of every telling, was that moment. "I have 6 hungry mouths," she said, and the cowboy smiled. "Then let's feed them together." A promise made in dust and desperation, kept through decades of devotion, and resulting in a love story that would outlive them both, passed down through generations as proof that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the hardest ground, and the strongest love begins with a simple choice to help, to stay, to try. Mason and Teresa Rhodes lived out their days together in contentment and love, surrounded by the family they had built and the legacy they had created. When Mason finally passed in 1928 at the age of 72, Teresa held his hand and whispered that she would see him again soon. She followed him 18 months later, dying peacefully in her sleep at 70 years old, and was buried beside him under a cottonwood tree on the ranch they had built together. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered for the funeral, filling the small cemetery to overflowing, each one a living testament to the love that had started with a chance meeting and a cowboy's smile. The Rhodes Ranch continued through the generations, always keeping the values that Mason and Teresa had established: hard work, family loyalty, kindness to strangers, and the understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help someone feed their hungry mouths, whatever form those mouths might take. And somewhere in heaven, if there is such a place, Mason Rhodes found his Teresa again, took her hand, and said with that same warm smile, "Ready for the next adventure?" And Teresa, laughing with joy, said what she had said 46 years ago: "Yes, to all of it. Wherever you are, that is home." Their love story was complete, fully lived and fully resolved, ending not with sadness, but with satisfaction, not with loss, but with legacy. 6 hungry mouths had become a dynasty, and a cowboy's kindness had become a love for the ages, proving that the best stories are not the ones that start with ease and comfort, but the ones that begin in struggle and transform through love into something extraordinary and lasting and true.